written by Natasha Crane. And today we're talking about chapter 2, which is explaining and understanding the fact that we are surrounded by secularism. And so what is secularism? We've talked about it. This is your sort of little pop quiz here at the beginning. What is secularism? Irreligious, that's right. The belief that the material world, us, is really all that matters. God or religion is irrelevant. Okay. You know, a secular, and when you think about that, the secular worldview is fundamentally at odds with the biblical worldview, simply because secularism says, well, this is irrelevant. And because we are surrounded by secularism, it has an extensive implication. Man, I can't talk this morning. Maybe it was the 7 cups of coffee. No, I'm just kidding. Because we're surrounded by secularism, it has extensive implications to our daily lives. Okay, we can't hide from it. We can't ignore it. We have to understand it. And as we get into the coming weeks, we're going to talk about how to deal with it. But before we talk about dealing with it and handling our biblical worldview in the midst of a secular world, we've got to really understand what's going on around us and come to grips with what really it is and why it exists. Secularism, the problem is, it is defined by what it is not. You think about it. Secularism says we are not religious. Okay, well then, what are you? We'll talk about it. A biblical worldview adheres to the authority of God. Okay? And everybody in the room the reason you're here is because we all agree on that. God is the authority. And that describes our reality and prescribes an acceptable human response. So in other words, when something happens to me, Matt pointed this out last week, as things happen, how we react to those, our biblical worldview defines them. Okay? So it is something that it's not so much what happens, but how we respond. Okay? And I started my career scheduling production. Over here, there was a bunch of machines that were making car parts, and it was my job to schedule what was made in those machines, how much. Though it seemed like we weren't schedulers, we were reschedulers, because we spent more time. The joke was we needed to order whiteout by the 55-gallon drum, because it seemed like we spent more time rescheduling than we did scheduling. And that's kind of like, we were just talking. If you plan out much more than a couple days, God just kind of laughs. You hate it, but and it's like, we spend our life planning. Now we spend our life replanning, because things happen. And how we respond to it is as important as how we make our first step. So, you ask yourself, why is there secularism in the U.S.? Why is the United States have this thing called the Constitution, okay? And the First Amendment to the Constitution, which begins the Bill of Rights, it says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. All right? Our founding fathers, when they sat down in 1787 and brought some rules to what we were and who we were as the United States of America, they decided that there would be no law that says, okay, Lutherans, you're it. Okay, Catholics, you're in charge. You know, okay, Church of Christ, you're in charge. And they said that you're free to exercise that, whomever you are. Lutheran, Catholic, Jewish, whatever. Thus, our political structure in the United States is by definition secular. Okay? It says religion, we've got to keep religion, and this is where it gets. Do we take it out, or we allow it to happen as people see fit? Frankly, it's a good thing. Okay, when you think about it, step back and really look at it, it's a good thing that those guys said, you know what, we're not going to have a state religion. And we're not going to do anything that gives any of them advantage over the others. We're not going to do that. And frankly, that is a good thing. But we should never be ashamed to profess our religious beliefs in the public square for discussion and consideration. That's the big but. Right? Now, we have to realize, going back to my first statement, that the biblical worldview, is inherently at odds with a secular worldview. Conflict begins from the very beginning. Conflict's going to be there. Again, it's not so much to avoid the conflict. It's how do we deal and respond to the obvious conflicts. And that's what we're trying to understand. Because today, conflicts, are inevitable. And you know what? 200 years ago, the conflict was inevitable. 1,000 years ago, the conflict was inevitable. And I can tell you, 2,000 years ago, the conflict was real. Okay, so we, 20th century U.S. did not invent this. But it is inherently baked into who we are. So, if we're going to be efficient, we're going to be effective in dealing with the conflict, there's a few things we have to really come to grips with. And realizing that, sadly, there is no such thing as a neutral worldview. In the attempt to have a, basically neutral concept of religion, you can't really have a neutral worldview. We can try it, but societies function on what is considered good and bad. And your personal worldview determines just that. Okay? Historically, this is some of the conflict. Historically, the United States has been rooted in Judeo-Christian worldview. I mean, we can go back and argue that, Washington and Madison and all those guys, were they Christians or were they just deists? In other words, they believed in a God, but were they Christians? Well, again, not for today, but when you look at it and you think about the last 250 years, most of how we determined what was good and bad came from this document on morality. Now, as we have progressed, and unfortunately, as more people not just ignore this, but they reject it. Okay? There's a difference between ignoring or flat out rejection. Okay? I think of raising teenage daughters. There were days when they ignored me. And there were days when they rejected me. And I think you understand the difference. Unfortunately, as more people reject Christianity, other worldviews define what's good and bad. And what has resulted, and this term, the author uses this term, what has resulted is an increased militance to purposefully push Christian values out of public life. Now, the word militance, that's extreme, violent, or confrontation. Again, what we deal with today more than ever is not just the ignoring, but the flat-out rejection. Okay? And that's where things have changed in the last, let's say, 100, just throw out 100 years. Okay? Now, we could fight back. Problem is, it's against the rules. And when I say fight, I mean we get physical. And, we've got these words that are called, turn the other cheek. That says, no. If they, when I say they, not us, get extreme, get violent, and get confrontational, afraid getting physical, militant, extreme, and confrontational back is not the way we're supposed to respond. Okay? That's just not, because I can tell you the first thing I want to do is get angry. Okay? Emotion. I read stuff, I hear stuff, I see stuff. I get angry. I want to turn over some tables. Jesus did, so why can't I? He did take some liberties. So, as our culture, as our friends, as our family, as those around us, reject our beliefs. How do we get to the point where we can coexist, another big word today, or better, communicate? Just communicate. Okay? How can we just have an intelligent conversation? How do we do that? Well, that's what we're going to talk about in the coming weeks. Is, how do I deal with that? How do I communicate with that? How did, in 300 years, Christianity become legal and they basically converted an empire when it was so militant against them? Yeah, we could talk about that for a month. You could write, how much time can you spend studying that, and how that happens? I mean, books and books and books have been written on it, right? So, thoughts. we're going to be done real quick if you all want to talk. Yes, sir.
You mentioned ignorance versus rejection. Lots of times rejection begins with ignorance.
Well, and
We
that's,
don't spend time in the Word, we don't recognize God's authority, and then all of a sudden we form our own
yeah,
religion, belief system, whatever it happens to be.
that's right. That's one of our problems as things is we have let other people define who we are. Okay? You know, the biblical worldview is not a bad thing. Okay? But we have let other, because we don't know how to communicate. We don't know it. And maybe we haven't even convinced ourselves what's really good about the gospel. Because we can't articulate it, we can't communicate it. Somebody else is doing that for us. And again, the ignorance, as Rick says, the ignorance leads to rejection. Because if you let your enemy, and I'll use that as a term, if you let your enemy define who you are, you've already lost. So, let's talk about why do you think a secular worldview, let's play, for lack of a better term, devil's advocate. Why is a secular worldview so attractive? Next week we're going to talk about why it's attractive to Christians. Let's talk about now why it's attracted to the world. Why is secularism attractive? Yes, sir. You only have to be responsible to yourself. That's right. It is. Yes, it's easy. Sure it is. No, I do what I want to do. You know, 90% of the people in the U.S. believe that there is something out there. There is a greater power. There is a deity. 90%, 9 out of 10 people say, yeah, I believe there's something out there. And that a belief in God is fine, as long as it doesn't require anything of it. Yes, sir. Yep. Excellent point. We have a different definition of freedom than they do. Excellent. Good summation.
I think sometimes things that we can't see or understand, like I said, people acknowledge God exists, but maybe that particular person doesn't quite understand or recognize that place in their belief, so they just push it aside. I mean, we do the same thing with certain scriptures that are very complex. So, I mean, we all understand how that works, but tangibly, sometimes it's difficult to see the spiritual world and God and how He moves in the world, and sometimes it's just simpler to shove it aside and just live your life and not worry about it, no matter what you truly believe deep down.
It's easy to ignore what we refuse to understand. And, ignorance, and I don't want to be just full of cliches this morning, but ignorance is bliss. There's nothing more complicated there's nothing more easy to follow than things that you just ignore and put aside. Yes, sir.
Part of the reason why secularism is attractive, at least in the United States and in some of the other Western democracies, is because we're still very much in control of the worldview that was first set out in the Enlightenment. The idea that through reason we can identify the right path, that reason will lead us to things that are understandable by human beings. And to some extent, if you believe that this is sufficient, has been validated by all of the things that have come out through science and technology, for example, through scientific methodologies that really have stemmed from Enlightenment thinking. So it's easy, I think, if you're a secularist and you don't really want to have a religious
Why do I need all those rules and restrictions when, and, you know, and I think sometimes that's why when you see people that seem to have it all, self-destruct, because while they have it all, but they're missing something, and that is the value of life that comes from this. Or you get into something where I believe something, I really believe it, and I find out that, well, that's not really the way it works, or that's not really the way it happens. Then you kind of self-destruct, because I in myself have determined it's this, and we find that doesn't work, or that's not right. Well, I have nothing left to fall back on.
There's also a false dichotomy that is being created in the secular world, that somehow religious people are opposed to the results of rational thinking and the scientific methodology. So science and technology, somehow if you are religious, that you would reject, that you would find all that is illegitimate.
Yeah.
And so that is something that we have to sort of be ready to give a response to that, right? Because I don't think that that's certainly true out in the community that I live in. But we have to be ready to give a response to that, because it's a very easy criticism of Christians.
Yeah. And some of it is our own fault, because we don't take the time to even understand why we believe what we believe, let alone be able to communicate it. And, you know, or say what we're for or what we're against. You know, we can, as we get more technologically advanced, the good becomes gooder, and the bad becomes badder. Okay? The conflicts are just much more. Think about 50 years ago, for those of us that were alive. You know, how we got information, how we argued, and how we settled differences, a whole lot different than what we do now. Now, that's a good thing in some arenas, and in some arenas it's a bad thing. And the further we get, you know, and again, it's an hourglass, the further we get, the more good and the more bad that are there. And we better be careful to understand how we get to the good as opposed to the bad. Yes, ma'am.
Quite often we are tossed by waves in the wind because we don't have a stability and a grounding. And there is an attitude also that ignorance does not excuse you from the law or from, because you can't get away from paying taxes. Ignorance of your taxes doesn't mean you won't pay. And I think in the scriptures, if you claim ignorance, you didn't know, there's no excuse for it, because you still have the consequences of sin.
And I would say that, you know, what was it in 1900, what the literacy rate in the United States was, as opposed to today? I would say we have more responsibility today, because we have more at our advantage today than someone had 125 years ago. I mean, that's all, with all of this, of all that has happened, we have much more at our fingertips, which means we have much more responsibility to be able to make sure that we're not either ignoring or flat out just ignorant, just not paying attention. And as Tom said, you know, because in a secular, because there is no higher authority, then morality is defined by the shifting sands of self and popular consensus. You know, what's everybody else doing? I mean, the first thing a lawyer does is, what's the precedent? Because if there's a conflict, how have those conflicts been, has that conflict happened before? Yes. What was the outcome there? You look at a precedent. For us today, well, wait a minute. And how many times have your kids said, well, so-and-so did this, why can't I do it? And we are just as guilty as the 14-year-old who says, well, Peggy got to do that, why can't I do it? So you have the self that just says, I want, I should have. And then you have popular consensus that says, well, look at all this. You know? Problem is, I look at Chris, and I say, I wish I was 6'4", had hair, and could sing. Problem is, I'm not Chris. So one of two things can happen. I kind of go back and I think myself is giving me a bum rap. And I think to myself, I can't get any taller. I mean, I can buy all kinds of shoes, but ain't no way I'm going to get as tall as Chris. You know, I can try to fake it, but no. See, I've got to come back here and I've got to look at this and say, you know what? For some reason, God decided I wasn't going to be 6'4". And I got to figure out what I need to do with 5'10".
It's a broad stroke around it. You mentioned self, but secularism promotes selfishness, greed. It relieves responsibility to our being.
And, you know, and at face value, secularism is a good thing. Okay? Now, when it comes, it's a good thing. It's why the First Amendment was written. But, like you just said, it leads, what does it lead to? Okay? What are my responses? Okay? How do I respond to Chris being 6 inches taller than me? Well, I could cut off his legs. Okay, that would work. But no, that's not the solution. Yes, sir.
We still don't understand that there's basic differences between us and them. And we think that all we need to do is talk about these things and they'll get worked out. Well, I'm not sure that's ever going to happen here on earth.
Right.
No, I really don't think it's going to happen. We're always going to be in conflict with ungodly people, and whatever way they're defined. And we think that we have to somehow sit down and talk with them and get all this settled. And the last, I'm going to say, about 700 years have proven that that's not going to happen.
Yeah, like we talked about. You know, we're not here to save Winchester. That is an unrealistic goal. What's our goal? 10 families a year. 10 families. Because we're never going to, the 120,000 people that are surrounding us here, we're not going to do it. It's not going to happen. It didn't happen 2,000 years ago. It didn't happen 700 years ago, and it's not going to happen today. So we might as well stop putting that much pressure on ourselves, because that leads to the frustration and the ignoring. Yes, sir.
Well, what we think we want to do is to come to some sort of agreement, a compromise. And we've learned that when we compromise, we still don't get closer.
Yeah.
We just sort of stop talking with each other for a few minutes and we compromise. them go their way and we go our way. And that's basically what's gonna happen. We're gonna go with God, they're gonna go with Satan, and eventually we're gonna be separated. So, what we need to figure out is how to live with people we can't get along with.
The people that do not see the world the same way we do. Okay?
That's it.
Because secularism is an inescapable worldview. Okay? We're not gonna eliminate it. We're not gonna beat it. But we are going to continually battle it. The conflict is going to be ever present. Okay? And beginning with Genesis 1, as Frank and I were talking about beforehand, the biblical worldview could not be more at odds with secularism. And that started in the beginning God created. The first statement of the Bible is at odds with a secular worldview. You know, it started at the beginning, and it's not going to end until what you said, that ultimate separation happens. Now, we could totally separate. We could sell this real estate. We could buy something up in the mountains of West Virginia, and we could all go up there and live in a commune. You know, all 100 of us, let's just say. And that would probably last, maybe, what do you think, 3 months? Tracy says no. She'd be done in 3 weeks. Okay? You know, what's that? You know, secularism is in the culture air that we live and breathe. You might as well just come to grips with it, because we're not, unless we head back up on the other side of Romney. It's everywhere. Every day is a push and pull of competing worldviews. It's in the media, it's in politics, it's in entertainment, it's in education, etc., etc., etc. Yes, ma'am, sir.
It's also within self.
Absolutely.
Within our mind, where our minds are divided.
Yeah. It's a battle right here, because I want what I want.
So we have also a biblical phrase called we are in secularism, but we don't have to be of secularism.
That's exactly right. That's right. It may dominate us, okay, at work, at school, with family. You know, secularism could just be bombarding me. It can dominate me, but it doesn't define me. It can't define me. This is what defines me. This is what defines how I understand where I came from, why I'm here, and where I'm going when it's done. So you just might as well get used to it. Yes, ma'am.
We have a problem that if we can't isolate,
No,
because that's against the Lord's command,
that's right.
because we're to love our enemies. We have to be available to tell them about God if they ask.
Yeah.
And if you isolate, they get the attitude, well, you don't want to talk to them because they won't talk to you because they think you're better than you are. And you get into that kind of a conflict, it's, you have to go back and search the scriptures how the Lord wants you to interact.
Yep. And we all have a different way of interacting. Again, our 350 million worldviews that are in the U.S. could be argued that everyone has their own. We've got to figure out, if we want to be effective and efficient and not bask in our misery, because, or separate. Worse, we stay here and just be miserable. That's not what God wants. He doesn't want you to be miserable. He doesn't want you to be in constant conflict. He wants you to communicate. And he wants you to understand everyone's perspective. Now, I'm not going to claim to understand what Tom's thinking. And I'm sure there's a lot we disagree with on. Disagree with. But it's the biblical worldview that says that's okay. You guys need to get along. Still love each other. Still care for each other because we have a common bond. And the common bond isn't the fact that, we're both white, middle-aged. Let's go with that. Middle-aged guys that grew up in the mid-Atlantic of the U.S. Our bond is here. And how we look at our Creator, how we got here, why we're here, and where we're going when it's all done. That's what pulls us together. Like I said, if we ended up in the mountains, we're going to learn real quick how different we are. But we don't live together. If we compromise, as Daryl said, if we compromise and intend to combine secular and biblical worldviews, if we try to combine them, secularism is going to overshadow it. Okay? Because secularism it's easy, it's convenient, it's popular. But if we try to marry the two, and that's what we're going to talk about next week, is for Christianity, for Christians, why is the secular worldview so attractive? Because it is. It's around us. We cannot avoid it. So, because if we compromise and attempt to combine secular and biblical worldviews, secularism will overshadow. So, all else fails, read the directions. Now, as we said, this is not an easy book. There's a lot in here. And the further we get away from, 600 AD when this was written, the further we get away from 600, the tougher it's going to get. But look at the resources we have at our fingertips. Your phone, you've got access to the libraries of the world. Think of the access to the information. I mean, I wish I could go back to college now, because we used a card catalog and microfiche and were limited to what was in the library. Man, I would love, and with AI, holy cow, I would love to go back to college. Except for the, and I've got some raised eyebrows. The good and the bad. But we can't avoid it. We have to learn to work within it, live and exist and coexist and be that ambassador, okay? And be that ambassador that we're supposed to be. Because if we use this as a weapon, as we have been accused of as Bible thumpers, which I believe is the term that is popular these days, as Bible thumpers, well, that's just not effective. We're letting other people define who we are. We have to be better at it. A book that is pretty famous, Sun Tzu, is a military strategist that wrote the book, The Art of War. And it is one of the most, I don't know how many copies and all have been sold and read of that, but it was how you conduct war. And Sun Tzu said, "It is said that if you know your enemies and know yourself, you will not be imperiled in 100 battles. If you do not know your enemy, but know yourself, you'll win one and you'll lose one. If you do not know your enemies or yourself, you will be imperiled in every single battle." So the key is, know yourself and know your enemy. That's how you do battle. Now that's pretty militant, but I'm afraid that's what we're in the midst of. And we've always been in the midst of it. But know your enemy and know yourself. That's how you do battle. Next week, we are going to talk about secularism and how it is so compelling even to Christians. Chapter 3. Last thoughts? We got a minute.
Going back to our founding fathers, they created this country to be a secular country so that we have freedom of religion.
Correct.
But that does not mean that religion does not shape public and politics.
Correct. Yep, you are exactly right.
Was still important to them, and spiritualism was still important. So I don't think as Christians we are called to be completely separate, and we do have a voice in those matters.
Right. And that's an argument, Anna, that has been going on for years too.
But I think it's very prevalent today, just as it has been, as this needs to be separate.
Yeah.
Politics and Christianity, politics and spiritualism are separate, and they absolutely are not, and we can't
Yeah.
separate.
Yeah, their intent was that, there will be no law respecting religion or preventing the free exercise thereof. And we should bring it, we have to know how to bring it to the public square effectively and efficiently and not militantly. Because what they set up, we can talk about this, don't get me started. Okay, what they set up was so that we could communicate and that we could argue and we could banter. That was their thought. Okay? Get it to where, in so many words, fight it out without fighting. And that's how it was built, and that's how it will be sustained. Not by thus saith the Lord. No, that's not how it's going to work. It's not how it was designed to work, and that's not going to work because we are a minority. This is a great tool, but the problem is it's a sword, and today we're in a gunfight. Taking a sword to a gunfight, you're going to lose. Okay, so we've got to make sure that we level the playing field, and that is with logic and reason and love and patience and kindness and how we, again, goes back how we respond. All right, thanks everyone.